What's happening, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review episode 6 of season 4 of Better Call Saul, an episode called Piñata. Sorry about the extreme tardiness for this review, but last night I got invited to a press screening for the new movie The Predator, and I definitely found myself stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of which show or movie I should give my preference to. In any case, if you want to check out my review for The Predator, it is the last video posted on this channel. But let's talk about last night's episode of Better Call Saul. We definitely find ourselves in a situation right now with Better Call Saul where it almost reminds me of a great fighter who keeps defending their title and has this incredibly long streak of title defenses. Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould just keep confirming over and over again that these are two of the best showrunners in the business. As always, I had an absolute blast listening to the podcast Better Call Saul Insider in between the two episodes, where Vince Gilligan, Peter Gould, as well as some of the cast and writers always talk about last week's episode. And they're talking quite a bit about the scene where they recreated Saul Goodman's office from Breaking Bad. And they basically had all those props and all that decoration in storage for years, just folded up. They just unfolded it and shot it again. And not only that, they shot the scene on film. They wanted the look and atmosphere of his office to feel as close to Breaking Bad as humanly possible. And Breaking Bad was a show that was shot on film, so they decided to do a slight, subtle format change for that one particular scene. But my big question after last week's episode was, what was in the box that Saul pulled out of the wall? And I read an interview on Collider with Bob Odenkirk, and he actually confirmed precisely what was in there. He was talking about some of the mementos. He said there are videotapes of his commercials, and there are passports. I'm sure there's money in there. And there's that little Band-Aid box that has the coins that he found in season 2 of Better Call Saul when he had a flashback to his youth in his dad's store. So, mystery solved. But moving on to episode 6, Piñata, I felt like this episode did a particularly good job of jumping around in the timeline to really show the contrast and a variety of characters in this show. Obviously, this show is about the ongoing saga of Jimmy McGill and his transformation into Saul Goodman. But the episode featured this incredible flashback back to the early 90s when Jimmy McGill was still working in the mailroom of HHM, and it was absolutely fantastic seeing Kim, when she was still a third-year law student, working in the mailroom as well. Now she's out-competing and outpacing Jimmy McGill in the office because he's stopping at every booth to talk with people, to BS about their Oscar pool. This is the year where Howard's End and Sin of a Woman are up for a bunch of Oscars. And the office is all excited because Chuck just had a major victory using a really obscure case to get a victory for one of their clients. And as Kim is congratulating him, it's just heartbreaking how innocent Jimmy McGill is at this point. Granted, Jimmy McGill had already been in trouble as a criminal at this point. We know he already had a career as a con man at this point, but when it comes to discussing matters of the law and trying to interact with his big bro, he almost seems like a befuddled, naive child in a lot of ways. And it creates this perfect contrast to the character that Jimmy McGill is becoming in the present day of the show. But he's not completely green because, as we see at the end of the scene, he sneaks into the library to start upping his game when it comes to the law. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that the show keeps providing these sharp contrasts from different timelines, because the changes in Jimmy McGill are so slow and so subtle that we might not even notice them if we didn't constantly have these stark contrasts. But this episode also featured some slow creeping heartbreak as well, where we can see the slow inevitable schism between Jimmy and Kim. Right out of the gate, he tells her that he's not going to be going to see the therapist, that he prefers not to do any navel gazing, he prefers to push forward. Kim gives him a little pushback, and you can tell she's visibly disappointed that he decided not to take that step. But Jimmy, in his own way, is really trying to push ahead, and we see how earnest he is in trying to make plans for their future law firm together. He goes to sleep designing logos, and we see him at work making calls, trying to figure out which vendors might be capable of building a giant sign for them. He basically wants a giant sign like you would see outside of a casino. And I feel like this is Jimmy McGill at his sweetest, at his most tender, in his earnest desire to build a lasting partnership with Kim. And we see how it absolutely rips him apart when her career really starts to surge. She has a conversation with Rich over at Schweikart and Coakley, and she talks about how she would love the opportunity of building a banking division within their law firm, and they offer to bring her in as partner. It's a huge opportunity for her, and she's 100% earned it. But as she and Jimmy are discussing it over lunch, we can see it's absolutely ripping him to pieces because he's incredibly proud of her. He wants her to have this opportunity. But obviously this completely wrecks his own personal plans that he had for the two of them. And at one point he has to excuse himself from the table. He pretends like he has to go to the bathroom, but he just walks away and just has to kind of compose and regroup. And it's almost like we as the audience can visibly see little pieces of his soul being chipped away. I think this plays a huge role in being the catalyst for change that we see toward the end of the episode. And speaking of little pieces of Jimmy's soul being chipped away, but he receives the news that Geraldine Strauss is dead, and he's really moved by her passing. He wrote the will for her, and he also featured her in one of his commercials. And it's almost like he can't even get through the conversation, and he has to acknowledge to the person calling that he's no longer practicing law, but he does refer them to HHM to handle her affairs. But something tells me we'll never see Jimmy McGill taking taking on those kind of clients and bonding with them on such an intimate level. But Mike has some great scenes in this as well. We see Mike constructing this giant dormitory basically for Werner and his German crew. He's basically building housing and entertainment with lazy boys, any kind of gaming imaginable, a full-blown bar, a gym. But more importantly, 24-hour surveillance by him and a couple other people on his crew so they can monitor what Werner and his crew are up to. And when Werner and his boys arrive, Werner's very impressed. However, he does have this one person on his crew named Kai. And you can tell there's going to be trouble between him and Mike because when Mike's calling everybody over to give them their instructions and give them information, we see that Kai's much more interested in pouring himself a beer. And when Kai finally reluctantly comes over to listen to Mike's spiel, he's asking all these obnoxious questions about when the girls arrive. And just watching Jonathan Banks' impassive, stony reactions. It's some of the funniest stuff on TV, and he's barely doing anything. Somehow Jonathan Banks, with just like a raised eyebrow and these dead eyes, can communicate so many volumes. At this point, we know the character so well, we can almost see the wheels turning in his head. And it's absolutely inevitable that these two guys are going to tumble. And we see that Mike does give some special instructions to his surveillance team to keep an eye on Kai going into the future. And quick question for the diehard Breaking Bad fans out there. Can we safely assume at this point that their giant project is basically building that huge super lab that was featured in Breaking Bad? It seems like it would be a giant red herring for them to be working on anything other than that. But I didn't know if there's any evidence in Better Call Saul so far to confirm that it's actually the project that they're building. But speaking of great scenes, Giancarlo Esposito, he gets a very quiet but very intense scene where Gus goes to visit Hector Salamanca in the hospital, and he tells him this long story about his poverty-stricken youth. And initially I was wondering where it was going because he's talking about how he used to water this fruit tree and then he basically brought it back to health and he started making a small living selling the fruit in town, that he never tasted anything so delicious. But then the story takes a darker turn where he sees that somebody's been eating the fruit on his tree, and as it turns out, it's a coyote. And he sets up a snare and he cripples the coyote and he traps it under the house. And when the coyote finally reluctantly comes out from under the house because it's so hungry, not only does the young Gus wrestle it and capture it, he keeps it for a very long time, forcing it to survive in his keeping. And it's very clear that he looks at Hector Salamanca the same way. He wants him to live, he wants him to survive, he wants him to be crippled and completely under the control of Gus. It was a really bone-chilling moment. But once again, Giancarlo Esposito, world-class actor, he always hits a home run anytime he's on screen. But getting back to Jimmy McGill, Bob Odenkirk is just hitting home run after home run, and I feel like the writers serving him up one great scenario after another. He goes in to visit Howard to pick up his $5,000 check from Chuck's will, and he sees that Howard is really low in his spirits, that HHM is really suffering, they're laying a lot of people off, they're basically downsizing, they're bringing in consultants, and we see that Howard's having a real crisis of confidence. And Jimmy decides just to give him some tough love and basically tells him to stop wallowing in self-pity. He says, you're a shitty lawyer, but you're a great salesman. Get out there and sell. And we see that it actually does have an impact on Howard because he's like, fuck you, Jimmy. But it actually kind of helps raise his spirits and gives him his fighting spirit back. But we also see that Jimmy's pushing forward hard on selling all these untraceable prepaid phones. He's stockpiling a ton of them at the old nail salon, and his landlord there cautions him about the risks of quick, easy money. Nonetheless, then we get the best scene of the episode where Jimmy goes out into the night to find those three punks who mugged him recently, and in a genuine, sincere gesture of friendship, he offers basically to bring him under his umbrella. He says, I'll basically pay you not to rob me. It'll be safe, reliable, consistent revenue, etc. These punks decide they're having none of it, decide to try to rob him again. And I don't know if Bob Odenkirk used a stuntman for this or not, but he showed some serious wheels. He hauls ass, runs a couple blocks. I don't know how old Bob Odenkirk is at this point, but he is just booking it, and he runs into an alley, and as it turns out, he's laid a very elaborate trap for these three young hoodlums. And he has these two giant goons take these kids hostage, they take them to a private room, they hang them upside down, and then we find out why this episode is called Piñata, because he basically has his thugs smashing these piñatas with baseball bats while Jimmy McGill proceeds to threaten them and forces them to promise not only to leave him alone, but to spread the word that Jimmy McGill is not to be touched. We see McGill really making the transition into the Saul Goodman persona. And when the scene draws to a close, we get a great cameo from one of my favorite characters from Breaking Bad, Lavelle Crawford, who plays Huel Babineau. We see that he and his partner in crime pull off their masks. My hope is that if Lavelle Crawford is back on the show, maybe, fingers crossed, we can get Bill Burr back on the show. Bill Burr, I think, is one of the funniest guys alive. He's one of my favorite working comedians today. He's obviously insanely busy with both his stand-up as well as his animated series. And at this point, Bill Burr is much bigger and much further along in his career than he was back when he appeared in Breaking Bad. That said, I've heard Bill Burr in interviews talk about how much fun he had working on Breaking Bad, so maybe they can bring him back in. And in the teaser for the next episode, we see Jimmy referring to himself as Saul Goodman. It's almost like he's having his Heisenberg moment. Bryan Cranston in Breaking Bad obviously lived quite a double life between Walter White and Heisenberg. It was almost like a superhero or supervillain where you got your secret identity, and it starts to get confusing as to which one is your true self. Always enjoy those debates about Superman and Batman, where people basically put forward the idea that in costume is actually their true identity, but when Superman's dressed up as Clark Kent, that is a disguise. Or when Batman's dressed up as Bruce Wayne, that is a disguise. And I feel like with Batman, he almost has three identities. He has the Bruce Wayne that he presents to the public, he has the Bruce Wayne that he presents to his loved ones like Alfred, and then of course he has Batman. But very clearly now Jimmy McGill, his identities between him and Saul Goodman, the lines between those two personas are starting to get a little blurry. In any event, last night's episode was absolutely awesome. Makes me sad there are only 4 episodes to go. And once again, one of the strongest shows on TV somehow just keeps managing to double down and confirm its reputation. And I just can't wait to see what Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould have in store for us next. But I hope you enjoyed my reaction and review. Please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad, hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax. If I overlooked anything, definitely let me know in the comments below. And I'll be back at y'all tomorrow to review the season 1 finale of Castle Rock. But thanks as always for watching my channel. I really appreciate it. Onwards and upwards.